Hello everyone, welcome to QT, particularly when you come from outside the campus. Lovely to see many of you again, and welcome to those who for the very first time join us for what we call the Futures Unlocked seminar. We had 6 last year. Thanks, Elissa, you've been speaker number 2 for your contributions earlier on, and we'll continue, and it looks like we'll continue like this every last Tuesday of this year again to ensure we capitalize on the most important asset we have, our collective futures. We have to understand that future is unpredictable, and this is the same for our session here. But with the right attitude, resilience, and a bit of serendipity, I'm delighted to welcome, I think without any doubt, a person that is thought leading when it comes to deploying futures thinking and futures literacy to policy development and policy advice. I talked to a few people and said, I've heard, of course, about Will. Now you can hear him. Will, we were lucky, came up from Canberra, and Will is heading the Futures Hub at the Australian National University, which is a pretty impressive entity. You're currently on secondment, otherwise working for the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet. You've been affiliated with the Futures Hub down there in Canberra for a long time. And you're not most, but in particular well known for what's called the Policy Fit for the Future, the Australian Government Futures Primer. A very impressive document that, by some people here in the room, is also used when it comes to teaching for public servants and beyond. So you're already young in age, created a lifelong legacy. You have a degree from ANU, but today you will talk about many aspects. One that I like in particular is sort of meta futures, or the future of futures. Will might take sort of 20 minutes stage time. There's a lot of additional reading, a lot of additional slides. And it might be not the last time that we welcome Will here. And then when Will is finished, we move into a panel conversation. Will join that panel. I will welcome the different panelists closer to the panel. And then we explore collectively what we can do to institutionalize that future thinking. Now, before I give stage time to Will, of course, I would love to recognize, while we talk a lot about the future here, the important history, and with this, recognize the traditional custodians of the place where we're coming together right now and for the next hour of your life, and pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging, and of course highlight how QT is honored and delighted to continue a very proud history of collaborative education and shaping better futures. With this, Will, we are delighted that you're here on short notice. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our speaker for today, Will Hartigan, who will talk about futuring government futures.
Cool. Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. So I'm gonna set a timer for myself. Sorry, so I'm checking my phone. It's not important emails. It's just sort of get too enthusiastic and launch. Okie dokie, clicky thing. Yes, I've got lots of interesting things to share, but what I've realized a long time ago is I'm my own worst audience for working out what people are interested in, because I've gotten too deep. I'm too nerdy, too into the really conceptual, theoretical stuff, too much into government problems, Canberra, where hope goes to die. I'm aware that I'm in a very insular sort of space, and I'm often talking to people, so please feel free to put your hands up if somebody says completely incomprehensible. I'm going to try and rush through some things with the intention of then having questions to explore stuff in more detail, because I understand there's sort of some mixed levels of futures literacy, I guess, with techniques in the room. I'm not going to do an intro to futures style conversation. Again, briefly, I've been in the futuresy space for about 10 years. I've been in and out of the public and private sector before then, have a lot of policy experience with usually entrepreneurship and innovation policies, and some international relations, geopolitical stuff. So for me, that was the natural pull for me in this space, because really curious about what's changing in the world, how do we explain change, and I think also what's really critical with futures is not just sort of admiring the problem, but actually thinking, how do we transition Australia's economy, so maybe it's not so much just digging brown stuff out of the ground in real estate, which is really our fundamental competitive advantage for the last 50 years. We're not going to solve that, but I enjoy thinking about ways we might solve it, as many people in policy do. So, I'm going to big note myself a bit here for a reason, which is that I do think I've been very lucky due to this little authorising environment at Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet to go around and do a lot of futures exercises in different Commonwealth departments with state governments. I stepped out and did stuff with private industry. I've done stuff here with the Futures Hub. So I've done around 90-ish futures engagements over the past 4 or 5 years with different clients, a mix of projects, a mix of just workshops, consultancies. So I've done all this stuff. I know that there's lots of other really capable and experienced people internationally in Australia. I can point to like maybe 2 or 3 people I know inside government who've got as many experience over the past few years doing this into policy. Now, why am I bragging of such an un-Australian thing? Okay, so, but, what frustrates me enormously about futures is I still get a new Department of Climate Change recently wants to go look at the future of energy policy and this kind of thing and what it might look like. And they're like, it's very standard sort of engagement. I'm going to come along, do some stuff with executives, help them polish up a report. And I sit there stuck, staring at a blank screen going, how the hell am I going to do this? Why isn't it that having done dozens of these things, I'm still stuck every time working out what's the best way to approach it? And I'm in a constant state of indecision and anxiety about whether this is the right thing for them. I mean, is this going to have impact? Is this going to translate to actual outcomes? Is it going to be miring the problem? Is it going to be people go to a fun workshop for a couple of hours and return to business as usual straight afterwards, right? Are they going to go, this guy's full of snake oil and rubbish? What's even worse, the thing that really hurts is when you do take into account sensitivities and freedom of information requests and all the difficult agendas in the room. And people go, oh, futures, that sounds a bit waffly, a bit funny, isn't it? It's like, can we have something that's more about strategic risk maybe? So you dial it down to be the most pragmatic, practical, short-term thing. And then someone says, man, this wasn't futures at all. This wasn't ambitious at all. And you go, God damn it. It feels like steering between these poles of doing something that is genuinely, how do we change mindsets? How do we grapple with the really big problems that are confronting all Western democracies in terms of our democratic institutions being often not seemingly fit for purpose in managing the waves of social and technological and global change? Do you tackle that? Or do you say, you know, we want to try and dial your 12-month horizon into an 18-month horizon, right? Which is often the challenge for a lot of Commonwealth departments. And part of that has come to a lot of doubt about the effectiveness of a lot of the traditional futures techniques. And I've had many failures. Like I've had many failures being defined times when a project didn't land, when we spent a lot of effort at something and they said, that's nice, and it got shelved, never to be made public, never to be visible. Ironically, one of the successful projects I've been involved in are always classified, because if they've actually managed to change government's opinion, there's something I can never share with anyone else, usually, unless they're actually involved with it. And then the government changes, and it's even more locked away in the cabinet until the Archives Act means it'll pop up 25 years or something like that. So I keep wondering, like, am I doing it right? Or am I just very good at selling people at doing futures and then failing? And because of all this stuff, right? I'm just so sick of optics, FOIs, sensitivities, getting buy-in. Does it really matter? Doing more with less. So what I'm going to try and do is talk about my analysis, I guess, of like, why do I keep getting this wrong? I'm going to very much have a government perspective, and I think this is applicable to state and local government context, but also any large institution where I've done it. What are the key persistent challenges, and what do I think are the ways maybe we need to adapt or evolve futures practice? So look, again, not going to sit on this. This is just because sometimes people use words in all sorts of different ways to mean different things. When I say futures, I'm just, for the purpose of today, I'm meaning it's synonymous with strategic foresight, structured participatory exploration of possible, probable and preferable futures. But really, the key thing is to adopt this. We've got one vague view of the future that's in people's heads. To explicitly, let's pull that out of people's heads and let's compare different kind of futures we need to be prepared for. Because there's no facts about the future. It's not written in stone. We tend to treat things like AI as a giant asteroid heading for the planet governed by the laws of physics, but it's being deployed by humans. It's been created by humans. How it gets impacted is shaped by governments. Huge amounts of agency that governments have to do these things. And when they choose not to do nothing about something, that's just as an important choice as when they choose to do something, right? So again, the future thing is the future's up for grabs. We get to control and shape it. There are some things like climate change, like demographic change, which may be fairly baked in, but you know, how we deal with the implications of that, what actions we take today are not. We have huge agency and autonomy about the future, and it's about shifting people from how do we just deal with risk to actually how do we get governments to proactively nation build, create visions that people are bought into, create a better life for Australians, really. So that's my take on it. And definitely inside government, but inside most organizations, the way I conceptualize it, there's 4 rough types of thing or capabilities that you do. You're out there mapping in terms of what the future could look like. What information do we have about it now? I'm sure many of you have heard this already from 20,000 futurists. Everyone uses the William Gibson quote about the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. So I'm really sick of hearing that, but I'll say it anyway because it is true that getting outside of our bubbles and going and looking around the world and traveling and speaking to people, we can find lots of good clues about areas and places and people where the future already exists. I mean, who here is planning to live like another 20 years? All right, so I can see most of you guys will be around in the future. This building's probably going to be here in 20 years. Like, we can already, a lot of the ingredients for the future are kind of around us. It's working out what's going to stay the same, what's going to change. And things like climate change accelerate that. So mapping is really an understanding what's the evidence we've got about the future's going to look like. We have to make sense of it for ourselves, for each other, for decision makers. When we go and do these horizon scanning exercises, people get overwhelmed by how much information is out there. At some point, you've got a human being has to say the 3 things that matter most about the future to us are A, B, and C. And that's a really hard ask, but that's what making sense of the future involves. It's about deciding what matters and turning complex systems and change, interconnectedness and uncertainty into something partitioned and comprehensible and digestible that you can make decisions on the basis of. Challenging. So a huge part of this is simply saying what is in your head may not be the way things turn out. It could be dystopian, it could be Skynet and Terminators or Mad Max, where people think things are taking us. It could be wonderful AI solves climate change magically for us somehow, using the power of tech. It's about going in and saying, no, it's going to be maybe 10% of each of those things and 80% of something else. It's about saying that the institutional future, where your organization says, so he's like, don't repeat this. I'm going to say there's a Chatham House rules. Pretend I didn't say this, but example I often use when I go around government, I go to defence and they go, war with China is inevitable next year. Like, we must prepare, draft all Australians today. And I'll go to Department of Climate Change and they will say, no, we may or may not go to war next year, but climate change is definitely occurring and we need to take course now because it's a genuinely existential threat. And then I'll go over to the Department of Social Services and I'll say, well, climate change is 20 years off and war may or may not happen, but there are homeless people on the street today. So the lens you take really matters in terms of what is important and trying to juggle with what factors might be most consequential with policy spaces. And final, catalysing, which is the point. None of this has any point unless you turn it into some action today, something differently we do now as a result of our knowledge about the future. So how do you generate momentum and impetus for change? So against that, what works against those things, this is where I've got to check the time because I'll get excited. Yep, good. So this is one way to look at it. So this is what I see typically, I think not just in government, across many organisations, as some of the key barriers, right? We don't understand this. I go in and I say, let's run a really complicated backcasting horizon off visioning exercise and we're going to look at some scenarios and drivers of change, disruptive certainty, strategic risk. And people go, what? Also, it's not common business. Sometimes people will agree. If I go into any government department, I say, we need to be more strategic. We need to think about the future. Senior executive will go, yes, absolutely, totally the challenge. It's the how we then, and when it starts getting the details of how we actually start to this institution, things fall apart. So simply not under having literacy in what futures involves is a big barrier. Defensive routines is really big. This is not business as usual. We have critical, urgent and important things to do right now. We can't make time for this. When you're an organisation of 8,000 people, as many government departments are, I think it's a crappy excuse. But it occurs. There's a lot of resistance as well, because this is the annoying thing. I spend a lot of my career saying futures is really easy. You can do it with 2 people, you can do it in a small team, you can do it intermittently. It doesn't have to be a big 6-month-long project to interrogate the future of a policy space. The problem is I'm kind of lying a little bit, because futures often does make things more complicated. It forces people to confront things they'd rather not talk about. People are very good at partitioning in their heads. This is my problem space, and climate change, AI, social cohesion, that's someone else's. I don't have to think about that. And the more sometimes you bring these in, the more it complicates their picture. And you have to bring them out through the other side of that and give them tools to let them deal with it. But it does often involve confronting people with things they actually explicitly have decided they don't want to deal with. Decoupling, and this is another massive problem. Let's have a futures bit over here, which is going to look at the future, but the actual place we're going to think about strategy and make decisions is over here. It's a big problem. And futures theatre, I think, is the big one, right? This is the annoying thing, because I try and do things which are fun and interesting, particularly for public servants who often want an ethical job until they go into consulting. But they're there to try and think about. They've got to be often public servants because they wanted to engage with the big ideas and the big challenges and engage with reform. But then sometimes they feel, let's just step away from our day job, have a great day, we'll talk about all the big problems of the world, and then they get straight back to BAU the next. It's not embedded. So these are the big barriers. I would say the big fundamental one, though, that underlines this, is I do think we conflate why doesn't futures work in government well with why doesn't innovation, reflection, deep thinking and analysis work in government really well. There's a bigger, broader meta problem. And I think a lot of this has to do with, in Australia in particular and the other Anglo countries in particular, real confusion and uncertainty about what the role of government is, and not a strong agenda for saying that what is the public service here to do. We've got a rightful fear of unelected decision makers, but our federal public governments change every 3 years sometimes. We've had so much change in terms of prime ministers. In one of my portfolios, we had like 8 ministers over 4 years. So I think the question is, what really is the bureaucracy? Have I spelled bureaucracy wrong? I think I might have. No. Oh, yeah, sorry. I did this quick. What is government actually here to do for its people? What is the social contract? So without getting too nerdy and boring about it, this is what I talk about getting nerdy and boring. We had this thing called New Public Management as an ethos in the 1980s, which was like, how do we make everything more like the private sector? Citizens are turned into customers. We'll outsource and privatize anything we can because private markets and competitive markets are more efficient. And I feel like this has kind of run its course in the Anglo countries, and a lot of the pitfalls of these approaches have become clear, but there is no consensus about where to go next or what to do differently. There are ideas and lots of good ones.
Your attention, please.
Sure.
Your attention, please. Diligent fire, conducting a test of the fire evacuation system. Please disregard all time.
Yeah, I will. I'll keep talking.
No action is required.
Good. I'm so used to this. I'm very flexible for the future. So I think this is a core problem for futures because I'm giving myself 30 more seconds for this. We're done? Who's going to chip in and say, thank you, it's done. Okay, never mind. This is the big problem. Futures is really political, and this is dangerous territory for public servants, right? I sign a thing saying I'm going to accord to the Australian Public Service values, which says that public service is apolitical. There is no way to engage about serious change in the future without touching on things like values and politics, right? And this makes it very uncomfortable territory for public servants, particularly to write things down, to give recommendations, because we know if you look at any 10 years over the past 100, look at how much change there's been. Pick a decade, the 60s, the 70s, 80s. Think about the wars, the financial crises, the new technologies, how we went so quickly from mobile phones at the end of the 90s to the iPhone 10 years later to apps and then social media and then where we are now. The sort of change that's happened over single-digit years, right? And that's not even thinking of even more transformational technologies in the 20th century, television, the microwave, right? The problem is that those were all accompanied by vast social changes across the Western world as well. No.
Testing of the fire evacuation.
It's complete.
Please regard any further time.
Yep. What? Okay. I'm done. Thanks, guys. I'm out. Anyway, no time for this. But the thing is, this makes it dangerous but critical territory. So I'm going to again talk a little bit. One thing I would argue governments are having a lot of trouble with right now is this topic of misinformation and disinformation. Because let's be honest, over the last 100 years internationally, so I'm not speaking about Australia, I'm on safe ground if I'm talking internationally and generally, the major purveyors of misinformation have been governments, right? We've got that term propaganda, right? Control, and if we look at who the most trusted governments are in the world, they tend to be authoritarian dictatorships like China. So this is the very difficult territory. If you look at things like, I'm a big believer, why is one of the big drivers for why the climate debate is so fraught right now is big oil giants like Exxon got a 30 or 40 clear run where they had the evidence in the 1970s and knew that they spent literally tens of billions of dollars shaping that debate over the next 40 years, buying Congress people. So they had a huge head start, right? And they spent tons of money. And why as a company would you spend billions of dollars on something if you didn't think it was effective at shaping a future competitive environment, right? So my point is it's so difficult with, say, misinformation to disentangle that from policy, from what government does. We can't speak about it in a neutral way. So the government really struggles to do this. Now, I mentioned this is, again, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but arguably there has been the shift both forwards and now backwards. So you might not be able to see this very clearly. But, we had one model of thinking about what are people like in a country, and they're the subjects, is what they've been for most of human history, right? There is a ruling authority or elite. There are subjects there. They're propelled by duty. Their responsibilities to obey. We shifted, I think, in the 80s, particularly Anglo countries, to a more consumer-oriented idea. The language of power is economics in countries like Australia. How is the country doing? We're going to express that first in GDP, stock market indices, and employment. They're economic indicators because fundamentally Australians are consumers in a growth model first, right? It is only more lately, in certain parts of the world, returning to think of them as citizens first. So you're not customers, not consumers, but citizens. And I think the thing is this isn't a natural, ongoing, infinite progression. We're going back and forth between these things. I think in the US, a lot of people are thinking, actually, we'd actually prefer to be subjects. It's not just in terms of Donald Trump and the Republican administration spinning a story that's just going to make the economy better. There is a small but influential cohort who actually, no, we prefer the strongman. And I think this, is, again, is the APS is stuck here. I do not think we're in the citizen category or the consumer category. So, but this fight over what government is for, who it is for, the role of people and individuals and communities inside the country is up for grabs as part of this future conversation, and it influences every single policy topic, whether how we prepare for climate change and how much effort we spend on mitigation versus adaptation, or our role in the global community as a middle power, or whether government should actually do something about the dole and poor people in this country, right? It is all informed by what is the relationship of people to their government. All right, so with my couple of minutes I've got left, noting I'm taking another 30 seconds for the fire thing. Okay, that's the problem. Where's the opportunity? So the big one is, and I could do a whole other presentation on, like, right now we are in this volatile and post-normal environment where stuff is getting smashed all over the place. And it's not just Trump in the US. I think this has been the story of really almost the post-September 11 era, where the US retreated from being the sole superpower. But what we've got is we do not have the kind of political arguments that we had in the 20th century, giving us there are these courses of action where we should go between forms of socialism and capitalism. There's a lot of people here who do not have fixed beliefs here, and there's a lot of voids that need to be filled. This is a great moment for futures to try and carve out positive visions for the future. If you look at Western democracies, if you look at non-Western democracies, but lots of countries across the world, I think one common thread you can see is that particularly more progressive parties are really struggling to articulate a position on what a better future looks like for their countries. If you look in Australia, I think what we can see is risk and preserve, right? We have a huge amount of Australian homeowners. Many of us, we have more people here own more than one property as a percentage of our population anywhere else on the planet, I think. So I have a great life. I have a mortgage I've almost paid off. I'm in Canberra. I got kids. I got a safe, cushy public service job. I have infinite things to lose. It's actually really difficult for a politician to come and say, he's going to come and make my life better except cutting my tax, right? And that's the position a lot of Australians are in. That's a terrible way to build towards a better future. You go to developing countries and they're much more ambitious about the kind of change they want to see occur in their country. So I think what we're seeing is decline in the primary vote, and this thing filling up the void is that things like mass migration is the problem, right? It's a narrative and it's a story, and we don't have many great stories because the left wing has swung from being the people in the 70s and 80s who challenged institutional systems to being the protectors and owners of the institutional systems. They've become the preservation parties. Very difficult to articulate positive reform. And I think the government here, and this is very, again, boring stuff, but we are at technically, I think, several inflection points. Commonwealth governments distributed around the country post-COVID, so that's all these opportunities to do things differently, remotely and virtually. I get to this problem. AI is either magic, the new McKinsey Consulting, Wikipedia Plus, a money, energy, water hole, or a future royal commission, or all the above, right? We don't know, right? But it is transforming and changing things in lots of little ways. But I think we know that one thing it doesn't have is a profitable business model for most companies, yet there are billions of dollars being poured into this hole. We're not having to pay for it yet. So when we have to pay for it, that's when I think we'll get some more clarity about what those models might look like. But I can't predict what the internet ecosystem, which platforms are going to be dominant in 10 years' time. If I look at, again, the last 30, it would be crazy for me to make that kind of prediction. We're in for change, but there's opportunities there. But it could do amazing things for government as well. As I said, there's no consensus model for public sector reform. Great, nature abhors a vacuum. There's a lot of opportunity here, and there's a lot of hunger, a lot of appetite among senior decision makers to say, where do we go next? What kind of thinking supports us to get there? So look, rather than, I'm gonna kind of skip through this a little bit. So in terms of how I'm changing my foresight practice, I'm just gonna quickly say though that I really see this hunger being reflected over the past 15, 20 years. My futures practice was about exploring what the future could look like. And that has really gone down compared to more visionary style exercises about how do we run sessions where we get to envisage what the future could look like in a more positive way, what we call normative futures. What are the kind of blue sky and black sky scenarios that we wanna steer towards and avoid, as opposed opposed to unpacking different kinds of risks that could occur. This has been a big shift, I think, driven by the amounts of global volatility and uncertainty right now as people, and the voids in these things that I think we're seeing around us. So again, because I don't know the levels of futures literacy in the world, I think I'm going to end off on, just quickly, is that this is sort of the most traditional foresight model that's really been used since the 1970s, or some variation of it. There's details in the primer. I still use it a lot because it's easy for certain types of groups and executives. There's something where you go and pull on, here's all the things going on in the world. You then map them against a sort of importance and uncertainty matrix. So you say, okay, these things that are important and certain, they're baked into our strategy and planning. Other things that are important and uncertain, maybe like the impacts of AI on the workforce, we're going to turn them into scenarios to try and unpack those. And then we're going to look at various ways to use those scenarios to think about how our policies, strategies, and so on might survive. This is the most traditionalist of traditional futures methods. We use a few other ones. Again, scenarios to me are at the heart of futures, like telling compelling, imaginative stories about the future. I was showing my age. It's always like Star Wars to me. It's these first few minutes of like a greater world out there that you can give people's imagination that they can hook onto and imagine it without having to explicitly be told around, right? So I do these kind of things still. Where I'm moving to, and this is more of a preview we could dig into if people are interested in some future date, but so I'm changing the way this works though to match the one, I'm doing far more stuff virtually, so this is a big shift. So I'm having to think of methods that don't allow people to be in a room because the public sector is much more distributed. We have better tech platforms now for doing this. A big part of what I'm trying to do is race to scenarios more quickly and more accessibly. So now the way I tend to do it is really try and target, I'm spending more time on what's in people's heads. This is what I call baseline futures. What do people expect are the pathways we're currently on? I do another thing, which is I think that futures needs to play a stronger role in not just enabling these conversations, but actually injecting ideas about potential disruptions. Because one thing that people who are working in this space, I think, get access to is a lot of meta ideas about what's happening in the world. And I think we can actually speed up and improve processes by injecting some of those ideas. So we sort of go, what's in people's heads? What are some challenging things we can bring into the conversations they may not have thought of? We're going to think about, instead of strategic uncertainties and trends and disruptions and drivers of change, a lot of terminology, we're going to think about breaking what they think about the future into statements and questions to produce what in government is more something suitable to advice for a decision maker. These are the three things we predict or know or are confident are happening, and these are the three key questions we have about what might happen. We turn those into scenarios around those two things. We think about what I call a CXO ranking, which is like, let's rank scenarios by what level of challenge they present to governments and what level of opportunity they present to governments. And the ones we really want to focus on are the ones that are both max challenge and max opportunity, because those are the ones that focus them on transformation and transition. If they're all challenge, that's strategic risk and problem solving. If they're all opportunity, it's reliant on expensive investments now. We need to marry these things and then move exploration. So if we're looking at the future in a 10-year window, we need to talk about the 12-month window that we can actually start to do things to influence change. And I have a few other things that I play around with now that I'm more moving to that reflects that I think that the practice needs to evolve. We're more thinking about what futures are pulling us towards them, as opposed to merely what factors in our past are pushing us in different directions. What are the things that are in people's head that almost act with gravitational force on people's ideas of what the future could look like, whether it's Trump's America, strongman America, authoritarian America, whether it's AI solves all our problems. I think starting to articulate those heavy things, these ideas that have a strong pull factor on us. I'm going to skip that one, but I can come back to it. That's it. I'm sorry, I'm slightly over time.
You are perfectly in time. Thank you so much, Will. It doesn't get much bigger, yeah? So you talk about building the future nation that's hopefully ambitious and capitalizes on opportunities, and we gave you 25 minutes. And rest assured, you achieved a lot of insight with not a lot of time. Before we open up the panel conversation, we've got space for one or two quick questions.
And it's okay not to have any either. I know I blasted.
Come on, there one or two. Yes, go for it.
Well, I enjoyed the speech. My name's Keith.
Hi, Keith.
Change at one end and risk. And I'm thinking in relation to Australian governments, organisations and Australian people. Travelling overseas, you get an understanding of how Asians, Middle Eastern, European people think about risk and how Australians and Australian organisations think about risk. At the other end, you've got, I think you used the term futurism, or there was a term.
Foresight. I use many terms.
Thank you. Foresight. And you've got innovation.
Yes.
Now, I'm the proud holder of 4 international patents, a lot of trademarks, and I've worked in the innovation space. I'm just interested in, you mentioned the word decoupling on your slide early on. Do you see a decoupling between foresight and innovation, and what do you think that means to Australia?
Man, that's a really big and difficult question, because I mean, innovation to me, because I'm a nerd again, policy nerd is the big challenge for Australia. Because there's a question here about sort of innovating towards something versus innovating and then see where that takes you, right? So look, I'll just tackling the risk part first. So I try and stay away from risk, and I try and stay away from events, because risk to me is, I guess, a fairly reductive view of risk, right? But that it involves things that could happen you to be prepared for. That's part of the whole futures paradigm. It is something that's quite different from change, particularly change which, how do you make sense of change occurring in many domains which have compound and intersecting effects? How do we reconcile the kind of changes that will happen at the same time, the old and the new, between political change, social change, technological, and we turn that horrible amount of interconnected complexity into something. And I think that's quite different from risk, because I think risk, you do need that narrower, tighter focus on what are our objectives, what are our plans, what are the things we hope to achieve, and we look for events or disruptions that might affect those, right? Innovation, on the other hand, I do think is about an investment mindset, I think, and this is the real trick, often shifting government away from a risk mindset into an investment and ideas mindset, which are how do we put money into things that have the opportunity, big bets, to pay off over long term and allow us that ability to shape future events, as opposed to taking a mitigation or contingency approach. So I think all of these things are part of the puzzle for governments, but the problem is we're natural risk managers in the public service, because that's where our threat comes from, that something came from left field and the government wasn't warned and we failed, not how can we help the government actually succeed. I mentioned that what governments choose not to do is as important as what they do. So their decisions not to fund innovation, their decisions to have Australians who are in poverty or in food insecurity are decisions. There's sometimes we have good reasons for them. And I think the question is how do we, where I think futures offers the opportunity, or foresight offers the opportunity, is say there's a future where your kids and our kids will be better, where we can make smart decisions today and it doesn't need to come at huge cost if we act today as opposed to after the risk has already occurred.
Thank you. So are we basically saying we're lacking foresight because we're overemphasising risk? Would you agree?
So this is a worthwhile general point for me to make anyway. No one in the OECD is great at doing foresight systematically and continuously, almost. As in, this is not an Australian problem. There are very few successful futures and foresighting people units that have long track records in any EU country. The EU OECD has some. Singapore has a fantastic unit. There are things outside of government like Horizons Canada and some things. It's hard. I went shopping around for where are the best models of practice for this stuff. Really hard to find. And I think you mentioned Asia as well. You can see very different approaches. If you look at China, for all its flaws, it has taken a very strategic, like a company almost, where it said, no, we're not just going to try and predict what could happen and take advantage of it. We're going to go further than that. We're going to dominate these spaces in 20 years and we're willing to spend big to do so. When I do corporate foresight, that's often what companies want to do, big multinationals, is say our preferred future in 20 years is we're the monopoly. We're the only person in this space. How do we get there? And I think that's a really clear strategic intent where foresight is very useful for that. It's hard in government. It's much muddier to say what should Australia look like in terms of success in 20 years' time, because that's politically contested.
We might leave it there. Thank you so much for those stimulating questions. And thanks again, Will.
Thank you. Do you want to leave this on?
Just leave this on, please. Just for your information, this session will be recorded on our webpage. You can see the entire recording, and if you don't mind, the slides, as well as this document will be shared. So you get access to all of this. You mentioned futures theatre in a different sense, but when we came together a few weeks ago, we tried to work out what else can we do beyond coming together once a month. And thanks to those who were there, we co-designed the idea of we need to institutionalize this somehow, and you have a Futures Hub and keen to learn from you. So I'd like now to invite our panelists, and let me start with Dr. Elissa Farrow, our second speaker, one of the global and leading minds, not only in the Southern Hemisphere, who spoke about strategic foresight. You put your fingers everywhere, an upcoming symposium as well, end of March. Thanks for joining us. Amardeep Sandhu, who literally uses technology to turn lemons into lemonade, worked in India, New Zealand, and works closely with the government as well. I'd like to invite Kylie Hansen. Kylie, in her case, the DPC stands for not the Prime Minister, but the Premier, but equally impressive, Executive Director, and for, I think, 20 years or so with Brisbane City Council. And then last but not least, our very own Carla, Dr. Carla Liuzzo here, Senior Lecturer in our Graduate School of Business. Your PhD touched on the Arab Spring, and you have a track record in the global aviation industry. Warm welcome. What I'd like to do is, for 15 minutes, if we switch on the light for something, working title, Futures Theatre, that really summarizes methods, approaches, is available as a service to our local community, what problem would we try to solve here? What's the net benefit? And maybe, if you don't mind, Elissa, could I start with you? What problem would we try to solve here? This one, yeah.
I think this is working. Can
Yep.
you hear us down the back? Yep. Great question, Michael. And I think building on what Will was talking about is what one of the biggest problems that organisations suffer from when they're thinking about futures approaches is a hand to help them through the process. And that hand is not specifically a single consultant or a single institution, that I think that organisations being able to pull together and go to a space or a place to be able to unpack not only the futures of their industry or the futures of their broader context or their futures that are theoretically being eroded right now, a space where they can feel safe to have these broad conversations. And when I think of a futures theatre as a concept, that's what I think of. I think of a space that's movable, that's physical and virtual, boundaryless, but is full of people that typically don't get together to talk about that
Very nice. So,
topic.
Yep, it's a flexible, virtual, physical space, safe in nature, that allows us to explore together. Amardeep, what comes to your mind? What problem do you think we could solve if we, let's say, mid-year, together with the Graduate School of Business, and warm welcome to Kevin D'Souza, if we switch on the light for something like a Queensland Future Theatre, what problem could we solve that we currently cannot solve? Yeah.
I think you got to understand one thing, that the future is going to happen, but we don't know which one. The question is, how ready are we as a government, through policies, or organization, through operating models, to adapt and thrive in that future? So this is a place where you have a dynamic approach to understanding not only what the possible futures could look like, as you said, but how would you thrive in that future? And that's a place to come back and put minds together to see how you make your strategy, your policies, your operating model in context of the possible futures.
Before I go to Kylie, is this like a two-stage process? So envisage the possible futures, if I narrow down on those, and then you work out on how do I thrive in those futures?
Yes, but I also want to say one thing, and let's point out many things that governments fail to do or cannot do because of systemic conditions, is that we should also not think that we are creating the future. Remember, we can only envisage the future. Right? Through policy, you can try and maximize the thrive in the future. But you are not creating the future. So understand this is a place where you actually got to envisage different futures and see how you as an organization are able to thrive and contribute to that.
Thank you, Amardeep. That brings us to the compelling question: aren't we creating a future by voting and hosting the Olympics? A future that maybe was not necessary. But Kylie, representing the Queensland government, also maybe the city experiences, what problem could such a future theatre solve? And create benefits
Michael,
for, let's
I'd
say,
say to me, there's so many problems. So the Premier of Queensland has made it pretty clear some of the priorities for him, which are around health, they're around housing, they're around crime, they're getting ready for the Olympics. It's about a big infrastructure. So he's already spoken to people about that. So ultimately, you could pick any of those for this theatre, but they are really intertwined. I think, to take Will's point, these things don't sit separately to each other. So a really simple example I give to people is health policy and health outcomes for Queenslanders. And when people don't have stable housing and when you aren't employed, you have terrible health outcomes, right? It's a really simple way to look at it. And so people who are making health policy decisions need to also consider things that might not seem immediately connected, and that is what's employment, what's the economy doing, what's housing, do people have social housing, what's homelessness like, because these things are all interconnected. So I don't know that we can pick one thing and stick to it with specific boundaries. I think there's a number of things that are really intertwined that we could look at through a futures.
So do you envisage a model where everybody who's joining and using this theatre would bring their own problem?
Yeah, so they can all bring their perspective. The trickiness with that is it makes it hard, it makes it complex. You can't put silos up between them. But that's the challenge. That's the only way that we're going to solve these things, is to not have these hard drawn lines with a Nico pen, say that's out, that's in. That's what makes it really hard.
Fluid. Yeah, and it's like to the point Elissa made, you're very, very fluid. Carla, you've seen a lot around the public sector. You're teaching in that space. You've been in the private sector. If the futures theatre like this would exist, again, in your own words, what problem could be solved that otherwise could not be solved?
Well, I absolutely share what Will was talking about, in the sense that I think any futures work that we do has to bring in political struggles and has to think about the kinds of assumptions that we make about future political systems. So I think all of our futures work needs to think about, post-capitalist systems, even taking out the assumption that we will be the democratic form, and I'd like to see us be really engaged in those big conversations around political economy and bringing that into futures work. So I would love to see us do something around tackling inequality, or trying to understand or at least map out what Australia's inequality is going to look like in sort of 10, 20, 50-year horizons.
Yeah, thanks. Will, as a director of strategy and practice of the Futures Hub, but also other labs and hubs you've seen, what do you think? What could be the compelling value proposition of an entity like this based in Queensland?
So I hate doing this, but I think it's really important, which is that we need more shared spaces for diverse viewpoints to come in and kind of have discourse in a constructive way. And I think this is Futures is perfect for that. And one thing I love doing is when I get to do stuff for local government is I think that Futures is easiest, frankly, when it's at an extremely local level, when you can ask, how is this place going to change? How's your job? How are your kids? Is your kid going to be walking to school in 15 years or not? There's a lot of these very simple questions about how we live and work, which I think that local lens is sometimes a better way to think upwards about the big shifts from that. So to me, that's if it's a physical local place, I think that's the first thing, is how is it a place where people can come and talk about what they'd like from the future. And then I also take the term theatre, if you're sticking with that. Well, I think Futures is fundamentally about telling better stories. So in fact, most of government work is about telling good stories. I think evidence often comes after the fact. We find the story first and then we assemble evidence to fit it too often. But I think there are some extremely negative, bad, powerful stories in the world right now, that everyone's in it for themselves, that it's on to you to manage the governments cannot provide for your retirement, that we always have to cut, that everyone's out to get you, that there's murderers and rapists stalking the street everywhere, and don't let your kids go out from school. Stories are really important, and I would like to think maybe it's a place where you could learn to tell better stories collectively to influence that change. I think that's.
So you see it as like a source of optimism?
I'm thinking a puppet show. But no, I think it's got to be about constructive. So I think that it's so easy for this stuff to turn a bit dystopian and about risk. How do we avoid these horrible things coming at us in the future and do other stuff? I think we need more local community-based ways for change, because Australia has already built its capital cities to try and avoid public squares and protests and other things. We don't have the pub where unions were formed in the first place. I think even if it's just a little bit, something where people can come together who are agitating for change, agitating for different visions of what the world could look like, and discuss what resonates with them, what inspires collective action. That would be cool.
Can I jump in? I'd actually written down, in terms of like the capabilities that we would be wanting to uplift through our Queensland theatres, is imaginative capability, like being able to envision something that is beyond us now, but actually something we want and something we could work towards, and having that pluralistic view and encouraging a plurality of possibilities.
Just to echo that. No, I was going to say really quickly, imagination and conceptualization, two things that are treated with disdain across much of government and are the most critical capabilities I think we need.
Yeah, so as we're talking, my thought was also to a Futures conference that I went to a number of years ago in Turku in Finland, where they actually demonstrated a blending of drama and artistic concepts in futures making, and had trained or great improvisers or great actors actually acting the future out for people to actually explore. And at the symposium that I'm organising coming up at the end of March, we've actually got people who are sharing how to explore and unpack the futures using Ouija boards, through cards, through embodied practice and dance, through attuning with nature and the lessons from nature and certain bird species. And so for me, when you're able to provide a space where people can come willingly to prototype, practice, create, it actually does then open up those possibilities. And I think the creative thinking skills, yes, and the blending of those domains that we don't typically have in sort of formal corporate structures, like bring in the improvisers, bring in the folk singers, the people that have been sharing stories, and especially our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And the collective sharing and narrative and futures making that they have been embodying for thousands and thousands of years. Mainstream Anglo, speaking from my own point of reference, can learn a lot if we open our minds to diverse ways of thinking, even from our neurologically divergent friends in the community.
Thanks. Will, I'd like to ask you a question, Amardeep. Will, you talked about the government says what it's doing and what's not doing, but very often, quoting Rumsfeld, we don't know what we don't know. So how can technology, Amardeep, help us to imagine beyond what humans can imagine?
So one of the things in the use of technology we found, especially with generative AI, is that it can be very creative. So what you call hallucination can actually turn into good creative. What we do not know and do not understand is why would we give a human being the credit to be creative and say that AI is not allowed to be creative? So the question for us is going to be, if we use technology to get creative solutions, are we as humans gather together for a complete understanding of our world to be able to see how good that creative solution looks like? So it is for us to decide whether that's creative, and for that we need to be not one person thinking it through. We need to be a collective mind who has understanding of the complex ecosystem that we live in, that includes our values, includes our shared experiences, and non-shared experiences. So it's got that whole thing has to be there. One more thing in this theater that could be really helpful is, as we do it for many, many problems, we get a shared corpus of what is commonly known to us as what the future is, so that each problem can be looked within that context without wasting time. There is need for efficiency. And one last thing which I want to say, technology allows us to be systematic, and we can wash, rinse, and repeat. We can see how it's evolving. Otherwise, traditional methods take forever to do.
So can I argue with that?
Of course, go for it.
Yeah, I want to put one spruik out. Yes, they take. I agree. There's so many deficiencies and problems. To me, the journey is part of the point, though, and I think that's the mindset. To me, like, it's not the report or the outcome or the finding or the decision at the end that sometimes is significant. It's the mindset change by engaging with other humans and maybe even with AIs.
I will keep that though, because I'm very clear about that we do not hand it over to AI.
No, but I just mean to say inefficiency is sometimes a virtue, I guess, is what I want to say.
No, not really. Not sometimes, yes. Not really. I mean, if you take 18 months to do a futures project, you lost 18 months, right? And it's not because you lost it because there was, we were thinking about it. Nobody was thinking about it. It went back to BAU.
If I invest 18 months in conversations with other people about what the future looks like, and it's an investment mindset, I think it's different.
I tend to say, okay, let's come to that and say, you need efficiencies. You need structure. I mean, we talked about scenarios, right?
Yes.
We've got 2x2s. How boring.
Yep.
Morphological scenarios. 16 scenarios by 7 scenarios. Let's see how many permutation combinations are there.
At 5,000.
Yeah.
So that's a,
But cognitive, we can't control it cognitively. So let's understand one thing, human beings are limited. However, we need to take them along. They need to be a part of things, so I do agree that. But let's get efficient about it and be not that brilliant, honestly.
but there's an advantage what's called futures and not future.
Yeah.
Because we value
Yes.
plural. I think it's same true with opinion. Yeah? If we all agree, we wouldn't have as exciting futures. Kylie, you live and breathe this more than anybody else.
It's a statement when
Can you,
on the panel.
but you're in the middle of it. But can you comment on government role? Like, how important is it to accelerate imagination or?
Hugely. So what happens, of course, is so everyone can't just work for government. You know, it's so many people. So you have to split people into buckets, right? You have to put people in health and people in education and people in police and so on. But what happens is it starts to build silos. And so everyone starts to look at the future separately and they're not seeing the interconnection. And what I really like about what you're trying to do here, Michael, is to bring in the other voices, industry, academia, government, multiple voices, because we can't live in the echo chamber. That's the risk. That's when it doesn't go well.
Yep.
Yeah, I think there's a real opportunity for us to do that.
So, Elissa, maybe briefly.
I was just saying some recent work. I've been connected to co-design principles that Queenslanders with disability have been championing in Queensland government, and that means that nothing about us without us as the mantra, and government agencies, supported strongly by premiers, have pushed this to make sure that if there is an asset in infrastructure or policy that has an impact on a person with a disability or their family, that someone is around the table who has lived experience. And for me, futures making must always have someone with a user voice front and centre, and not just an expert sitting around the table, but that lived experience is key.
Might be sometimes.
You just made a comment about futures making. I keep saying you can't make the future. You can try and work towards the future.
I'm going to argue with that one later about it. We need a beer at 1 a.m.
We get a whole lunch break. I mean, it's interesting, of course, 20 years from here, I might be disabled, and 20 years from here, being disabled is a very different world. So, I mean, Jody, you do a lot of work around co-designing. I think co-designing is maybe different to co-futurizing. Last question, and we asked this every previous speaker, do you imagine a space that looks like a future retail store where you rock up, let's say I'm the government, and said, give me popular megatrends, main scenarios, possible futures, and they all act as accelerators. Could you imagine a world where I just help myself with, let's say, scenarios for housing or crime or whatever you want? Will, have you seen this somewhere, like futures on standby that I help myself?
So it does kind of exist both here and other. I mean, it's just the audience. That retail store is maybe only open to a very select clientele, and consultants are very good at having a very open retail store to do this. They'll just charge you several $1 million for going in. So I think just like quickly, I guess my problem is how much can you create a repeatable thing that's usable to everyone and as useful bit of intelligence versus you need to lean into someone's problem space and understand who they are, when they're coming from. Can we create evergreen stuff? There's a comment that makes nothing dates faster in fiction than historical fiction and science fiction, because they're always about moments of the time. I think the same is true for futures. It's very hard, I think, to have stuff that endures in this space because the world is always changing. So I think that's the tricky question. It's a consultancy person thing.
No, fair. But we could talk about like we make it a public asset, and I know that Stefan from CSO said megatrends are generic, scenarios are situated. Open up the floodgate. You've got 5 minutes in your immediate future for questions. Any questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, question for Kylie. I wonder what is the government position on human AI collaboration for future insights?
What's the government position for what? Sorry.
Human AI.
Government inside,
human AI.
Yeah, position in using human AI collaboration for future thinking and scenario analysis.
Look, it's in the wings, I would say. So there's a new department that got created, which is around open data and customer service, and take a whole of sector, whole of government approach to do with AI and all things data and tech. So that's been a big step. That never happened. That was always shuffled, there was a little bit sprinkled throughout all the departments. So that's come together, which has been, so they're really taking the lead on that. Look, there's new policy being written, there's new ideas that are being considered, and they're working with industry and academia. But do we have all the answers? I mean, absolutely not. And that's part of what my team does, is to look around what's happening in other jurisdictions, how are other governments dealing with this, what are some of the mistakes we can learn, what might this future be, where are the opportunities. I don't have a nice, neat, boxed up answer to say, tick, done it. Yeah.
Judy.
So I guess I've got a question for you, Kylie, as well. I found it quite exciting that you're saying that Queensland government is trying to move from the siloed approach to a more, I guess, collective understanding when you mention health and housing. But then on the other hand, I guess I hear that the new land that's being unlocked and is being sold to developers does not include social and affordable housing. So I'm thinking, well, maybe in some areas they're doing it, maybe in some other areas it's yet to happen.
Look, it's a journey, and it's, I think what I would say is that there's a real shared interest and shared commitment to trying to look at things holistically and not have this siloed approach where people repeat the same mistakes or they reinvent the wheel, and that instead we try to look at things with a 360-degree view.
And so how do citizens sort of feed into that?
How do citizens feed in? I'm not entirely... Look, there's a lot of ways that citizens do, and that is everything from local members to getting involved in things that you can. I don't have a list myself on all the ways that citizens can get involved, but we certainly do research on citizens. We certainly talk to them. Local members are out there. So I think it's taking the opportunities that are local and across the state when they pass you by. Yeah, don't let them pass you by.
Yep. And then one more final question, please.
Okay, for whoever wants to answer it, whoever's most eager, I guess.
Me.
Increasing the multiplicity of options and maybe perhaps going micro and allowing the general population to invest a small portion in like small decisions all around the base instead of just investing in, people who then make decisions would be beneficial and allow for a more effective evolution over time with regards to the complexity of the multiplicity space.
And I've seen it happen where people, especially those, as I mentioned, with lived experience of certain things, that actually, rather than just say, oh, well, we'll always take them for granted, we'll always just give you a nice morning tea, actually pay them because they actually have rich experience, history, intelligence that actually is gold for policymakers. Sorry for doing the thumb down.
Don't point at me. I'm out.
I definitely think that citizen scientist model or the citizen way of enacting, but with some degree of recognition of the time, effort, cost it actually takes for some people to provide this rich insight is critical.
And just really quickly, I think it really goes back to Will's point earlier about where we see the role of government and having the conversation about perhaps changing that relationship of citizen to government, because it's only through then that we enable things like citizen assemblies or anything that we could envisage. But at the moment, we perhaps don't in Australia have that clear understanding of what our government is there to do, and that's probably happened over time.
Well, thank you so much. It was obviously really clear that there's shared momentum, shared passion, maybe not shared agreement, but it's beneficial, I guess. With this, I hope, you might be confused, but on a higher level. Let's thank the panel, Elissa, Will, Amardeep, Kylie, and Carla. And we have a very brief, popular token of our appreciation. You might be familiar with this one. Showing a world where it's just not what citizens, but algorithms as well. And Will, thank you so much for coming up, stepping in.
Thank you.
You're a great stand-up comedian, by the way. And Elissa, thank you so much.
It's my career.
We hope to see you all also for the next half an hour when we have light lunch provided and a lot of whiteboards. So if you have any ideas, any problems that could be solved, requirements you're having, or I hear you will. A better name than Future Theatre. By all means, write it down on that whiteboard. We continue, as I highlighted, last Tuesday every month. These are the upcoming speakers. Colin sends his apologies. He couldn't make it today, but he will make it in 4 weeks. And please register to stay in the loop. But as I highlighted, we also try to work out what do we on the days where we don't come together like this, and the Future Theatre will be one place where we come together on an ongoing basis. So with this, so much, I'd like to thank you all. I'd like to thank in particular Steph for setting up the logistics and everything, and again to the whole panel, and Will in particular. We hope to see you soon here, and in the soon to be open Future Theatre. Thank you so much.